Okay. Before we get too far into this story, I should say that the transitions between these churches, the dispensations or ages, are not all sharply defined. And there's events identified with each one of them, but those events sometimes take some time, and sometimes they take a lot of time to work themselves out. And also, the five churches are not homogeneous. When I first read about them, I thought about, well, there's these five churches, and this describes the church, and this describes the next church. But the churches were fragmented. Some of them were all over the world, different places, and they were within their own cultures and things. And as they all had some of the same characteristics, which is what we'll be going into, but they were still different in different places. And as the churches got older and became less effective, they became even more fractured. And the other thing is there's survivors from these churches. They don't just completely disappear. I mean, we look around, we see people in the Jewish church, we see people in the Christian church. They're not in the new church as we can see them. And these survivors are there because they're part of the path. And sometimes it's just not obvious that changes have actually occurred. The other thing is that, they've changed. They're not like they were when the last transition took place. So they've evolved, and they incorporate features of whatever the church is that comes next. And another characteristic of the changes of this succession of churches, and I'm only going to mention it briefly, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. These churches mirror the successful changes, the successive stages of a person's life. And as well, they can be seen in the succession of messages that are carried by the material in the Bible. And since the Bible is all about the Lord, it's also about the development of Jesus, his life up from his birth up through his glorification. However, my mention is to point this out, that it is useful to see the earliest church as having the innocence of infancy, and the middle churches as being somewhere in adolescence, maybe a little bit raucous, and then the later churches as more mature versions of ourselves. And lastly, the transitions, the break points, when one church goes into what's called vastation, it becomes not very effective at all, and a new one springs up. The early ones are marked by more dramatic events, and the last ones being almost unnoticed. And so now I'm going to get to tell you about how each of these churches, how they came to their end, how they grew up and lived their life, and how the next one began up to the second coming, which we celebrate on New Church Day, which is coming up in about 10 days on June 19th. So Swedenborg explains that the most ancient church basically lost its innocence. The love and complete trust in the Lord in its infancy was overtaken with a rising sense of self-awareness and self-importance. So just letting people alone to love one another just didn't work over the long haul. His descriptions of the beginning of the most ancient age say life was primitive, simple. He didn't use those words, but the description is there. And there was no need for conscience. We read about its decline in the Garden of Eden story in Genesis, and its end is marked by the Great Flood. And while that story is challenged Sometimes it's thought of as being just made up or um, just convenient or allegorical. It's undoubtedly a dramatic sign, as it's described, conveying that whatever had gone wrong with the old church was a big deal. In any case, what had happened was people came to trust more in themselves and disbelieve that anything that they could not confirm from their own experience, from their senses, things that they could look at and say, I understand that, I've seen that. So they lost their closeness to the angelic world. It's rarely been experienced since. And it became gradually estranged from God, and the ancient church took its place. So looking back, while the ancient church was said to be spread out throughout the whole world, and of course, you got to remember back in those days, the whole world didn't have all that many people in it, but it was spread, you could say, spread thinly throughout the world. The ancient church, too, was also quite widespread. And the event marking the transition to the Israelite church is not even close to a worldwide event like the flood was described. The delivery of the Ten Commandments was to a particular tribe, though at that point it was a fairly large tribe in obscure locations through the single individual of Moses as the key guy in charge of that. Some of the events around it are described as miraculous. It occurred soon after the Red Sea crossing. That was something that the Israelites had experienced themselves not all that long before the events on Mount Sinai. Throughout the early days of the ancient church, the people are said to have had a good grasp of correspondences. They used symbolic language in their writings, although most of the writings from that time have been lost. This is before the days of Moses. They had symbolic activities that showed that they understood spiritual matters. But over time, the objects and events that carried these correspondences came to be thought of being the actual divinities or divine entity itself. And so worship became more mechanical, focused more on idols. And idols were thought to have the powers of gods that the people wished to be blessed with. So the Tower of Babel story fits right in the middle of that period. Even people were sometimes worshipped. Pharaohs were worshipped, leaders in Samaria and many of the other areas around them. Early empires were also worshipped. In any case, if I understand it right, the ancient church died as a result of losing their understanding of the connection between the divine and the natural. So the Israelite church is described as a natural church. And that, of course, is kind of Swedenborgianese when you think about what does natural mean there. It doesn't mean it was out in the woods, although it was out in the desert. But it's a church in which the understanding of spiritual matters were embodied symbolically in the traditions and the rituals of the people. Swedenborg speaks about the church's story of its journey to the Holy Land and the battles to enter Canaan as representing our journey on the path to heaven. Their battles symbolizing our battles against temptations. The Mosaic laws and the emphasis on remembering to perform the rituals to maintain the education of future generations. That was sacred. That was the guidance that created a sense of need for the preservation of the word as it was then, that is, as the Old Testament was being developed. For the rest of the word, the New Testament was yet to come. Again, there's a lot more to say, but the question is, what happened? What went wrong there? The region was bolstered and preserved by the prophets, but even from their writings, it can seem that the people were turning away from their religion. And oopsie, something. There we go. They were losing touch with their religion. The prophets foretold future doom and gloom. Um, and So even though this sounds like a low point in the church, each one following the next one is getting in worse shape, is losing more connection. This was kind of an upward turning point. It was preparation for further connection to the divine uh, in the context of the Middle East, as described in the Bible, but during that time, preparation also in other parts of the world, and primarily in Greece and Rome and other areas in the Middle East. Now, to get into the next transition, we have to understand that where the influences come from that lead people toward good or evil. And these influences come from the spiritual world. We hear that in a lot of our sermons and messages. The people who choose evil in their lives on earth, in their next lives, they form the hells where they reside after some sorting out time in the world of spirits. The hells are managed to allow the balance of good and evil that comes to us, that comes to the people of the world, that influences us, is in a fair playing field, so that our choices that are made in freedom have given us the opportunity to really decide for ourselves who we want to be, if we want to be the people that we were supposed to become. And the ways this balance is maintained changes as the nature of the churches change, because the situation of the people and the situation in the spiritual world are changing along with that. So if you will, the keeping the lines of good and wise influence so they could reach people needed strengthening as each church became ineffective toward the end of its life. So at the end of the Israelite church, the need for a stronger method was met by the appearance of the Christian church through Jesus' teachings and example, and within which the Holy Spirit could be a personal and immediate internal conveyor of divine influence. But once again, the marker for the transition, that is the birth and life and crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection, was little recognized at the time. It was quite a local event, and it didn't have anywhere near the conception by people in the world as it certainly does today. So what went wrong with that one? What happened to the church? It was good for a while. Christianity spread. It was even spreading, still spreading after it started to be politicized. You can think about things happening like the Inquisition and the Crusades. And a few centuries after Christ, the church leadership had become much more secular in outlook. They aimed at accumulating wealth. They stood between God and the people as intermediaries, much more so than they do today, though the Christian church, as we think of it, sometimes the old Christian church is still very much around and active. But at that time, the church forbid people to read the Bible. It had to be read to them by those that were authorized to do so. The Reformed churches grew up to compete, so there was infighting. There was all sorts of issues between the churches. There were leaders of this church or that church in this nation or that nation. And part of the result of that was that the churches started to lose their influence in the world. But things had already started to change by then. You could, if you look back, you can see some of the signs of that. This was about the time that the Enlightenment in Europe started. Well, other things were happening in the spiritual realm. The last judgment took place, but it wasn't the last judgment that the Christian church expected. I think it was pretty much accepted that the last judgment was something that would happen here on earth. People would be given their bodies back, and then they would get sorted out, and judge would send people to heaven or hell as appropriate, depending on lots of things, depending upon which part of the church you belong to. But what Swedenborg witnessed was an event that took place in the world of spirits, which is a place between heaven and earth. And it's in the pathway of the influences that come to us as we're tried to be guided on a good path. We're told that there were some groups that were kind of stuck in the world of spirits. They had been taught by their churches on earth that they had to buy their way into heaven. So some were trying to figure out how to do that. Some were in the faith alone category, and so they weren't progressing. They placed very little value or energy on doing good works. So they were kind of stuck. They learned these ideas from the churches. They were building their own communities in heaven, or not in heaven, but in the spiritual world, as kind of artificial heavens. And they were blocking influx from heaven to earth. That's kind of a simplified statement of it. If you want to get into read Swedenborg about it, it's a lot more complicated than that. But the spiritual pollution was clogging things up, and the last judgment was the first step. It reordered the heavens and the hells. It took about a year, reflected in our time, 1757, I think, and it kind of cleared that path so that heaven could reach directly into each one of us, giving us new spiritual freedom that we enjoy and are entitled to participate in. Today, we're free to explore the Word in the light of that new heaven, to be cradled in a balance that between the influences of good and evil, and to have available that light, to be able to see for ourselves what fallacies the Christian church had, at least some of them, that they had started teaching. They don't all anymore still teach all of that. That's part of the influence of the new church. But the last judgment was done out of our sight. It wasn't detectable here in the way that earthly religious institutions worked. Nothing really changed. People didn't see the difference. Churches still work the same. Any change since then has been very slow and gradual. It's basically just getting started. However, as part of this, after that last judgment was completed, and Swedenborg had been called upon to reveal the inner sense of the word, to which people were exposed to, so they could be better understood and they could accept it better. Some of the, the Bible has got some tough places to read in it. And unless you've got a grasp of the inner sense, it's just tough sledding to get through all of it and say, what am I supposed to learn from this piece of genocide? Or what am I supposed to learn from this person's terrible behavior? The end of the book that Swedenborg wrote, called New Christian Religion, Another event happened. And at the very end of the book, I guess he hadn't sent it to the publisher yet, the very end of New Christian Religion, he announced that on June 19th, 1770, the Lord gathered and sent out his disciples throughout the spiritual world to preach of the new church there in the new heaven. It is this event we understand to be the birth of the second coming. And I say the birth because we say it hasn't stopped. You know, it's not just a single event that stopped and we look back upon and say, well, okay, that was good. When's the next one? When's the third coming? Whatever. Okay. But we know Swedenborg claimed that he was commissioned by the Lord to receive the inner sense of the word and to do so from his understanding. It wasn't dictated to him. It was explained to him. He was told in the language of the spiritual world, and he was told to write it down and publish his writings. He had trouble accepting that charge. There's a time in his part of his life when he was doing his theological writings, when he stopped. He had come to the point where he realized that he was going to be responsible for some of what's going to happen next. And he was well prepared, but he wasn't quite ready himself. And you'll also see that he changes some of his language and a few of his ideas as you look at the writings after that period from before. The new church was something that he hadn't seen it in the light that he was then charged to talk about it in. He was not getting his explanation of the inner meaning in Swedish. He wasn't getting it in Latin. He certainly wasn't getting it in English. He explained that speech in the spiritual realm was extremely rich, more like just receiving thoughts. And he was struggling to put these things into words, and he talks about that. And while in much of what he wrote, the spiritual message does come through, there are clearly places where you can see that he was influenced by his times, the world and the times that he lived in. When he was talking, I'm trying to make examples for people. He was using the examples that people in his age knew about or could understand. And the world has moved on since then. So he did not shrink from pointing out when something that he had received disagreed with the teachings of the church or the leaders of the church, the intelligentsia of the 18th century Europe. So he wasn't shy about speaking of those things. Just some of them he couldn't use the kinds of expressions that we would expect somebody in today's world to use. So what we celebrate on June 19th, New Church Day, is commemoration of the beginning of the new church on both heaven and earth. But in that regard, it is still just a commemoration. It's a reminder. It's not the primary function of the new church to have celebrations of events past. It's the function of the new church to do what all the churches were to do, which is to help bring the children of God of their own free will into heaven. Today, we understand that it is to offer guidance and not coercion through browbeating or shaming, but guidance to suggest to the people that they themselves, through the choices they make in this world and the motivations they embrace, are going to decide what kind of person they are becoming. And we get that message ourselves here in church pretty often. So that's in terms of what's going to happen next, that's a bit of a glimpse of that. So New Church Day celebrates the beginning of a process that happens in us. It's not looking back and saying, we're in a better age than our ancestors, Or sometimes we look around and we say, what in the world is going on in the world? What is happening? Why is everything so terrible? Perhaps you recall what Swedenborg saw over the door of a temple that he visited when he was, his eyes were opened and he was visiting in heaven. The inscription said, "Nunc licet," as he wrote it down in Latin in his writings, or as you see it translated, "Now it is permitted." And he said that this meant, now it is permitted to enter with understanding into the mysteries of faith. And of that, now it is permitted. I would emphasize the word now. In our now, today and tomorrow it will still be permitted. So what happens next is that we can do just that. And we can encourage that. We can enter into the mysteries of faith with understanding. It's widely taught, not just in our church, that the Lord speaks to us most clearly when we seek answers while reading the Bible. The word is constructed in layers, and if we read the literal words on its pages and grasp the inner meaning as well, our hearing will be clearer. And that's worth doing. Hear better. Communications from the divine. Not to hear what Swedenborg heard, but to hear what speaks to us. As to the state of the world today and the state of the new church, it's not a disaster. It's not in bad shape. It's still new. It's going to be new for a long time. There's many opportunities to come. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between an opportunity and harm or distress. There's much still hidden, but I think it's not leading to a new dispensation. We're just trying to get this started, and more will be known as the world moves on further, when the world is more ready. So to wrap up, I guess I would say that the second coming was not detected here when it happened in the way religious bodies worked. That was true in 1770. But over time, those churches have evolved. Art and music and science have flourished. The universe is bigger and the world is smaller. Travel and communication have vastly improved, although sometimes we complain about that. Much has been written about this, but that's just a footnote for this message, not part of today's message. So with hope and some confidence in the future, I wish you a happy new church day in advance. Amen.